Lord, they sleep restlessly and uneasily, yes, indeed.
In the house, November 7th, and Moscow skyscrapers are under attack by Ukrainian drones.
Just devils. People are just sleeping there after work, with their families, with their kids.
Muscovites are shaking with fear.
God sees, it's really scary outside.
Boom, wow!
I was so scared I almost crapped myself.
For the second time this week, Moscow is under attack.
Boom. I caught that on camera. Dmitriev, it hit the apartment. Can you believe it? Well, probably. Can you imagine that strike? Are you filming? Yeah.
The level of fear is at 100.
Oh, well, I see. Let me think.
A drone is flying somewhere above me. Right next to me. Something's flying in over there. Do you hear it? There's a drone over there somewhere. Look, look, look.
Those are missiles hitting.
Moscow's air defense is hitting residential buildings. The governor is furious.
That house got hit in the corner. And now there's smoke coming out. Is it on fire or what? I can't tell.
Whether you go or not, you can't escape fate.
Bryansk region missile threat. If possible, go down to the basement and leave any rooms without windows.
100% they'll get what's coming to them in life, for sure.
Said the Russian organizer. For the second day in a row, Moscow is under attack by kind Ukrainian drones.
They're just devils. People are sleeping there after work. Families, children. 100% they'll get what's coming to them in life, for sure. These are very rotten actions. This is not how people act, but animals.
And now attention. This was said by a Russian. Moscow is under attack, and as you can see, for the first time, there are mobile fire teams near the Kremlin. Putin was evacuated. These are, of course, sensational news. Meanwhile, Moscow Mayor Sobyanin has already reported on the work of the Russian air defense. Once again, mobile fire teams have been spotted near the Kremlin for the first time.
It dropped down. Most likely it was a fragment. Still, it fell.
A piece hit the apartment. Can you imagine?
We had just left, just started to drive out of the area. And then something just flew right by. I don't know, they called a lot of ambulances, took the guys away. I don't know if they're alive or not.
A series of explosions in Russia.
Something hit the corner of that building, and now there's smoke coming out. Is it on fire or what? I can't tell. An empty building.
Can you imagine that hit? Are you filming? Yeah.
Kyiv in 3 days turned into 2 guys defending Moscow. It's just shameful and cringeworthy.
Arif really caught fire, seriously.
We were told to gather our documents. There might be an evacuation. Shells are exploding, the ones that are loaded into planes. It's not clear how they're lying there in such a chaotic way. Basically, they could fly anywhere. No, you...
You said the grandmas found it. That's it, we'll take care of it.
Karma in action. 100,000 residents of Arctic Sakhalin were left without electricity because of a blast at the power plant. A powerful explosion, either a drone or sabotage. But on the Russian island of Sakhalin, a power plant exploded. A massive blackout occurred. Half of Sakhalin was left without power. Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk is also without water. Blackouts, no water, and no electricity.
That's how it is, Natasha. After the Belgorod Dam burst, in just 1 day we went from infantry to Marines. But we were lucky. While at the neighboring position, the entire dugout was flooded along with all the equipment.
A state of emergency was declared at the Belgorod Reservoir. After the strikes, damage to the dam led to the water level dropping by meters and the threat of flooding the Russian army there.
So, how do you like the dam as a crossing point?
That's how the dub position got flooded. The water overflowed the banks. The whole road is underwater.
With Russian brigades under threat of flooding, Putin's army is going under.
It's stuck, can't get out.
Economic crisis in Russia. Fuel and energy strikes on thermal power plants, strikes on oil refineries, strikes on railway hubs. Sakhalin is without power. Massive blackouts in the Moscow region. Attacks on the Kremlin, on Moscow. Mobile fire teams near the Kremlin. Putin's evacuation. We'll discuss all this with the well-known economist Igor Lipsits. Right now.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Igor Vladimirovich, what do you think about the mobile fire teams near the Kremlin? Do you see this as a meme or as a future reality?
Well, I can't verify it since I'm not in Moscow and we aren't able to check it. But of course, it's interesting that Muscovites stubbornly try to pretend. There is no war. The Moscow government does everything it can to support this illusion, spending insane amounts of money on decorating the city on various events so that no one even thinks that there is a war going on somewhere, that people are dying somewhere, including the elderly and children. Meanwhile, in Moscow, there's a lively social scene. Actually, it's quite amusing. Yesterday there was news that the society columnist at Kommersant resigned after working there for 22 years. I don't know the reason, it wasn't disclosed. But lately, whenever I visited Kommersant's website and saw the chronicles of Moscow's high society life, honestly, it made me cringe. I can't even describe it. It's so vulgar and disgusting that just the very discussion of high society life in a country that's killing its neighbors near its borders is appalling. I don't know what's going on there, whether it's the mobile group makeups or the resignations of socialites, but Muscovites, Russians, are stubbornly trying to pretend that nothing is happening. And if something does happen by accident, then it's supposedly because the Ukrainians dropped a drone. Why would they do that? What are they doing? Why would they do that? We're such good people, so why would someone drop a drone on us? It's all the Ukrainians' fault. This is apparently a normal mentality for Russians. We're the good ones, so why are we being attacked? It's a pretty nasty mindset. It's quite typical, at least until things really start to burn. As long as houses in central Moscow aren't burning, as long as the electricity isn't cut off in Moscow, as long as there's no blackout, Russians, especially in Moscow, will pretend that nothing is happening.
Igor Vladimirovich, you're absolutely right. So when we attack Moscow for the second day in a row, Sobyanin reports on the drones flying in and mobile fire teams are at work. But unfortunately, there is a huge amount of air defense in Moscow. It's very difficult to do this without ballistic missiles. Nevertheless, the thermal power plants in Smolensk, Belgorod, and other regions surrounding Moscow are being attacked. Do you think there should be a certain strategy for leaving Russia, at least for leaving regions without power? And how important, for example, is the information that, again, everyone is reporting that about 100,000 people on Sakhalin were left without electricity due to a failure at the thermal power plant? They wrote that there was an explosion. Most likely it was sabotage, but that's what happened. Again, well, for Moscow, probably the fact that Sakhalin is without power doesn't matter at all. What do you think?
Well, of course, because how should I put it? There's Moscow, and then there's something around it called Russia. These are essentially two different groups of people, two different ways of life. In Moscow, even if you look at the gross income per capita, the standard of living is about, how should I put it, like in Europe, not of course like in France or Scandinavia, but roughly at the level of the Czech Republic, about the same income. That is, over the past decades, Muscovites have lived almost the same as people in Eastern Europe, and in general have been quite successful and well off, enjoying life, and everything was good. But everything around, of course, was completely different, and now life there is starting to get really bad because the transfers to regional budgets are drying up, there is no money, and the local authorities are in a kind of panic. There, the discussion is either about how to cut spending on education and healthcare, which, believe me, are not exactly the strong points in those regions as it is, or about how to raise taxes on the population. And this in general is also a topic. Today I found it quite amusing. I'm subscribed to a certain Moscow public group. I won't name it, but it's a city-focused group, basically, and, well, there's nothing about the government there yet. But the first news of the day is that preparations are underway to raise electricity prices. Well, what can you do, right? There's no money, and so now they're planning to make significant changes to the electricity payment system. So in Moscow and in Russia, there's a tiered system, meaning there's a certain threshold, a minimum that's paid at the lowest rate. It's actually quite high. Usually it's enough to cover an apartment for a whole month. But now they want to cut this minimum by as much as 3 times. Then everything above this reduced minimum will be charged at a completely different rate. And accordingly, it will hit pretty hard, especially for those who thought they were living like in Eastern Europe, and accordingly designed their interiors the same way as is customary, with stylish solutions, like, heated walls. That was very trendy in Moscow, heated walls. Not just the ceiling, but heated walls, so there wouldn't be any ugly radiators anywhere. In general, all of this looked very beautiful. Plus air conditioners, plus air purification system. Well, there were a lot of beautiful things there, but all of this consumes quite a lot of electricity. And there are even people who build saunas in their city apartments. After all, you have to keep living beautifully. What else do you expect? And all of this runs on electricity, as you can imagine. And now this whole new system is suddenly turning into such insane expenses that no one really expected. Well, how did that happen all of a sudden? In this sense, the Russian energy sector is actually quite a vulnerable topic. It's actually in pretty good condition, but first of all, in a number of Russian regions, there is already a shortage of electricity, and the equipment at power plants is very worn out. The situation here is such that these attacks will probably be even more painful than attacks on oil refineries, because as far as I know, for refineries, they try to import equipment from China.
But
The power plants in general were equipped with European units. It will be difficult to replace them. That is, the entire set of equipment will have to be replaced. In other words, instead of buying just a single component from China, they would have to purchase the entire unit or the whole production chain. And that's quite complicated and, more importantly, expensive, which means in turn that electricity tariffs will have to be raised even further. So the situation here is kind of like this. Russia thought it was, how should I put it, invulnerable. A vast territory. Try to shoot, try to reach it, you'll dry up and die on the way before you get there. But when drones appeared, and now missiles as well, this supposed invulnerability of Russian infrastructure has become an illusion. And we are going to witness some very serious troubles, because I understand that Zelensky was quite serious when he spoke about the possibility of a blockade in Moscow. By the way, Russian public forums have thoroughly worked through this idea, writing that nothing like that is possible, that there are so many backup systems, so a blockade in Moscow is impossible. I don't really believe that, knowing what the technical support system is like in Russia and how much the people in the Russian energy sector have lost their qualifications. I suspect that if there are strikes on the energy sector, Russia will find itself in serious trouble, and most importantly, enterprises will come to a halt, production will decrease, and revenue will fall. And then there will be nothing to collect taxes from. So in this sense, attacks on the energy sector might even be more painful than attacks on oil refineries.
Igor Vladimirovich, what is Moscow's energy system like? As I understand it, Ukraine and Russia have different energy supplies. Ours is centralized, theirs is somewhat different. Moscow is one of the very large cities. How many people are there? There are 20 million residents. And how could it even be possible for Moscow to end up without power de facto?
You know, there was a blackout in Moscow. I don't know if you know this story or not, but there was a blackout in Moscow in 2005. And it wasn't because some power plant exploded, but rather, well, as they say, I apologize, but that's not my term. There's a wonderful story. Look it up on the internet. I absolutely love it. It's called The Clumsy Idiots. I apologize for such. Well, Dasha, I've made every possible apology.
Friends, please like and support Igor Vladimirovich. Give a like in the comments.
Write a lecture. That's what the author called it. The story is absolutely wonderful. I adore it and reread it from time to time. So, well, these same clumsy guys, they had a transformer blow up at the substation, the one that connects the different power units, and that triggered a chain reaction, escalating the energy crisis. And there was no one who could come up with a solution. So even back then, in 2005, the specialists' qualifications were so low that they couldn't figure out how to handle it. Later, with hindsight, they realized it could have been easily contained, but they failed, and Moscow was plunged into darkness for almost 2 days. So there was no explosion at the power plant, it was just this small element, and it already became clear that there was no way to transfer electricity from one region to another, or from one part of the city to another. So it's important to understand what this means. Russia is set up in such a way that there are other power systems, but there is still a centralized system for transferring electricity. Therefore, if there are strikes not just on the power plants, but also on the transmission system, on the links in this system, it will become impossible to transfer electricity to Moscow, and the city will end up in a blackout. And that means all Russian banks will immediately go offline because everything goes through Moscow. Moscow is an extremely centralized hub, a place for the entire country. That is, all of Russia is centralized through Moscow. All communications, all operations, all decisions go through Moscow. A blockade in Moscow instantly means a blockade of all economic activity in Russia. It's a terrifying scenario, but it's not protected.
Igor Vladimirovich, I think you watched with interest the carnage in Moscow, what was happening in New Moscow. It was connected with representatives of us, minorities, who had come to work, and I was horrified. I mean, I saw those bats, New Moscow bats, they were fighting each other. As I understand it, most likely this is related to economic issues, possibly wages. Igor Vladimirovich, why is this happening? And will such riots and protests occur more often? Such an important incident.
No, this isn't the first time, and I think it won't be the last. Usually different groups of labor migrants clash, fighting over some lucrative contract. Basically, someone intercepted someone else. Someone took away a client, people didn't get paid, and people came to Russia, enduring a tough life specifically to earn money. Losing that income immediately makes all the hardship of living in Moscow meaningless, so passions run high right away. That's why, of course, this is by no means the first clash. We've seen this many times before. So all of this is normal for Moscow. It's familiar, and there's nothing surprising about it. The scale will keep growing. Well, that's obvious. They'll start deporting people. That's pretty clear too. Russia is going through a rather strange period right now. On the one hand, there's a strong desire to expel all labor migrants from Russia. That's the position of one part of the Russian power structure. But another part is shouting that more need to be brought in. So on the one hand, they put up certain barriers for people from Central Asia, and on the other hand, they start bringing in Indians en masse. Well, I don't know if that's going to be any better for Russia, but it turns out that without foreign workers, many areas of Russian industry simply can't function. It's not just construction, it's already pretty much everything. Right now, there's this discussion going on. A lot of migrants have been expelled, but winter is coming, and there will be accidents in the utility sector. So who will be digging trenches in the frozen ground? You know, people are already writing to me saying that last winter, we, the residents of the building, were forced to dig ourselves. They told us either you dig it up and we'll replace the pipe, or if you don't, then you'll just have to sit in a frozen house. So basically, we got all the men together, and the guys went out to dig trenches instead of the utility workers so we could reach the pipe and have it replaced. I suspect that this winter, this kind of situation will become quite typical. Basically, there were hardly any serious repairs to the utilities this year. This kind of information is coming in from all regions. Just to repeat, the regional budgets have no money, they all won't get any. And that's why, for example, Moscow and other places are heading into winter with their utilities in poor condition. There could be numerous accidents, and judging by everything, the winter will be harsh. So we need to get ready. I'd say you should start jogging, do some exercises, and get yourself in shape. Because in winter, you'll need to be fit so you don't throw out your back when you're digging channels in the frozen ground to replace pipes. And if you don't dig a second channel, your child might get sick from living in a cold home. Well, what can I say? That's the situation.
Igor Vladimirovich, you always work with a young audience. You could even say with youth, since you are a teacher, a lecturer, and that's your mission. From a social perspective, how did you react to some of the protest music movements that began in Russia, St. Petersburg, Nera? So at first, young people were singing anti-war songs. Then there were a series of arrests, police vans, and so on, and he still hasn't been released. As I understand it, after St. Petersburg, there was the Kazan Cathedral, and after that, a wave began. A wave of small musical performances. Flash Vogue, yes. Igor Ilyich, well, of course, it's clear that this can't really be compared, for example, with our protest movements in Ukraine. But still, do you think these are warning signs, or is it not even worth discussing?
That's an interesting topic. Do you know why? Because in recent years, sociologists have given us a rather curious picture. The highest proportion of loyalists was actually among the youth. All over the world, young people are usually a kind of revolutionary force, a revolutionary stratum that is always dissatisfied with the authorities and in conflict with them. But here, we were getting information that the youth were, well, how should I put it, rather compromising. They don't want to rebel angrily, they want to fit into the system, build a career, and make a lot of money. And overall, I would say this trend of support was quite noticeable, and the level of support for the authorities among young people was quite high. Nevertheless, it seems they touched on a rather sensitive nerve for the youth. As you know, attitudes toward music vary at different ages. Of course, as you get older, your reaction to it becomes weaker, but youth, as always, is one of the most important triggers. And when they suddenly targeted a youth performance, especially since the performer was a very young girl, just 18 years old, it clearly struck a nerve with young people. And basically, their message is, we have nothing against Putin, but don't touch our idols. I think this is quite an interesting topic. Where this will start, where it will go from here, I don't know. But everything begins with some small acts of resistance. You know, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin turned to revolution after an issue arose with his older brother. He wasn't particularly interested in the fate of the proletariat, but when his brother was essentially punished, he somehow decided that he needed to get involved in the revolution. This ended up being a great misfortune for the Russian Empire. So when you provoke the youth, you can end up with some very unexpected consequences. And in general, I think it was a mistake to go after those young guys, the street singers Stop Time, I think they're called. Yes. Basically, you hit the youth right where they're most sensitive. They may be politically passive, but you touched on the topic of music, and that's a serious matter.
Igor Vladimirovich, of course, I can't help but talk to you about sanctions, about the Russian economy, about the military machine. I was talking to Boris Yakovlevich Pinkus at the beginning of the week, and he said to me, "My God, Dasha, the 19th package of sanctions, I'm just furious. I'm furious because they've adopted 19 packages of sanctions and it's done nothing." I'm not an economist. I can't argue with him at such a high level to debate with Boris Pinkus, of course. And I would like to hear your point of view. Are there really certain problems with the 19th package? What I've heard from economists is that 2027, 2029, everything has been extended, especially regarding liquefied natural gas. So this is a very lengthy and prolonged process, plus there are no tools to monitor the sanctions. I would like
To get,
your professional assessment.
well, look, here's what's important about sanctions. First, that they continue to be adopted. And what does that mean? That the positions are not changing. That's what's important. Let's make that the first point we note. Since the sanction packages are being adopted one after another, Europe continues to demonstrate its willingness to help Ukraine, support Ukraine, defend Ukraine, and its negative attitude toward Russia will also remain unchanged. Secondly, of course, the sanctions are not working as effectively as they could, but right now I am following a model proposed by one of the journalists, which I really like. This is the model that Russia can be killed by 1,000 cuts. It's a vivid model, not that you immediately cut a major vein and all the blood flows out and the person dies within 5 minutes. But rather it's many cuts. They may not be as deep as one might think, but they all bleed, and blood flows from each of them. The economy is weakened until a blood deficit occurs and the person starts to die, and the country begins to fall apart. Russia is getting more and more of these kinds of cuts, and in this sense, sanctions are working. Yes, not as strongly. Yes, not as effectively as they could. Yes, the control is quite poor. I agree with all of that. But these are all cuts, and with each cut, Russia loses strength, loses money, and loses the ability to finance its budget. And this is already accumulating. Whatever the sanctions may be, look, this is already the 4th year of the war. It will be 4 years by February, and we can see that the Russian economy has started to fall apart. Maybe it would have collapsed sooner if the sanctions had been stronger, but it is still falling apart. Look, Russia has started to see a collapse in overall production. GDP is going down, inflation is not subsiding, the budget has collapsed with a huge deficit, and it's unclear how the state will even survive next year. All of this is a consequence of the war and the sanctions. It's hard to separate which is more to blame, the sanctions or the war itself. But the sanctions add to the damage caused by the war, and in that sense, they are useful.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding the shadow fleet, the tankers. We've noticed that NATO is now trying to stop Russian military ships. This is directly related to the shadow fleet. These are truly historic events. Actually, last week, I think, it was reported that for the first time in a long while, a NATO ship stopped a Russian military vessel. Everyone wrote about it like some kind of shock content. Indeed, for NATO to stop something, that's shock content. So, do you think today there is a mechanism to counter the shadow fleet? Many economists believe that it is very weak, that it practically doesn't exist. France detained, released, and that's it.
I think so too. In fact, Russia could have been restricted much more effectively. You know, there's a good verb for this, to restrict. Exactly. I've been talking about this since last year. I'll even tell you when I started talking about it. It was last year, I think in early spring, when the European Union recommended that Denmark tighten the rules for the passage of shadow fleet vessels carrying Russian oil through the Danish Strait. I started developing this topic and people began writing to me saying, Professor, you don't understand anything. There's freedom of navigation. There's the UN International Agreement on Freedom of Navigation. You can't do this. I specifically checked these legal documents. Everything is possible. The thing is, it's very difficult, even impossible, to control ships when they're in international waters. That's understandable because this is essentially free global navigation and everyone defends it. But the Danish Straits are Danish territorial waters. That's a completely different story. And in this very legislation, the UN agreement is exempt for the number of hosts. It states there that if a vessel is passing through your territorial waters, and you have reason to believe that this vessel could cause environmental damage to your waters, your territory, or your coast, you have the right to stop that vessel and conduct a full inspection. And the idea was precisely to stop these vessels, anchor them in the roadstead outside the ports, not let them into the ports, keep them at anchor, and thoroughly inspect them. But I talked to some sailors. Since I live near Klaipeda, a port city, there are a lot of sailors, so I have people to consult with. And
Vladimir stops vessels. He has the fleet of the Russian Federation.
they told me, there's no problem. There isn't a single vessel where all the regulations are strictly followed. There simply aren't any ships like that sailing the seas. So if you thoroughly check for compliance with all international regulations and navigation safety rules, then on any vessel you can find and dig up so many violations that it would be stuck at anchor for months and wouldn't go anywhere. And accordingly, if you check it like that every time, it will spend more time docked than actually sailing. As a result, your turnover will drop sharply. You won't confiscate the oil, you won't confiscate or arrest the vessel. You'll just make its passage so complicated. In addition, there is an option which hasn't been used so far either. If you remember, there were 2 cable breaks in the Baltic.
Yes.
So you can create a perfectly reasonable scenario and introduce insurance against cable breaks for ships passing through the Baltic. Accordingly, Russian vessels will also have to pay an insurance premium. And this, accordingly, is also a deduction from the income from oil transportation and, in general, a decrease in the profitability of shipments. But none of this exists. There's nothing at all. Nothing. Igor.
Vladimirovich, I keep reading everywhere about the blockade of Kaliningrad, the blockade of Kaliningrad. I just have a question. I actually think that, of course, for NATO countries, this is basically impossible. It's simply impossible. They're not capable of anything, but that's just my harsh criticism of NATO. So I'm curious, Igor Vladimirovich, how realistic is this blockade of Kaliningrad that everyone keeps writing about in the media space?
Well, again, this is not entirely realistic because there is, after all, an agreement on the Suvalov corridor. And formally, a complete blockade is a declaration of war. So it's probably unlikely. And from time to time, of course, some conflicts arise. But this is such a dangerous topic because blockades are always, well, what is called a real reason for declaring military action, casus belli. Yes?
Belli's case.
Therefore, I do not think that Lithuania or other Baltic countries are ready to create a casus belli for war. But in general, they make such statements periodically. This is quite strange for me too. They are too weak to fight Russia, but they are making such a provocation. In my opinion, this is a rather strange story. But it's clear that this really irritates and frightens them. And the presence of Kaliningrad packed with weapons right next to Lithuania is, of course, an unpleasant fact. But it's difficult to deal with this. Although formally, on legal grounds, there is a formal basis for returning it to another state. Kaliningrad was transferred for a certain period of time. The term has long since expired, but no one wants to initiate all these procedures for the removal or withdrawal of Kaliningrad from the Russian Federation. Well, we'll see. In general, the city is in a difficult situation. They've now found themselves, well, how should I put it, in a situation where the only connection with Russia is practically by air. And it's difficult to fly because flying is difficult. For example, my wife flew through Kaliningrad. When you look at the flight route, it's truly breathtaking because the flight goes around all of Europe. That is, they fly over the extraterritorial waters of the Atlantic, over the English Channel, over the North Sea, and then enter the extraterritorial airspace of the Baltic. The situation in Kaliningrad is, of course, complicated. It's an enclave. It is almost completely deprived of any serious land connections except for the Suwałki corridor. Trains, well, there are also complicated problems with trains. So basically, only air transport is available. There was an attempt to launch a ferry from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad, but I still don't know whether they launched it or not. And it feels like that didn't work out either. So it's kind of a cut-off piece of Russia, rather weakly connected to the main territory and quite problematic, but packed with weapons.
Igor Vladimirovich, of course, I can't help but discuss with you our dear Trump Donny, the King of New York. As we like to say, Trump always checks out. But in this case, I read in the news that he was offered, they put on the table for him, 3 options for sanctions against Russia, and he chose the middle one. Not the harshest, not the weakest. So these are sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. It was already reported literally last night that Lukoil will be selling its subsidiaries in Europe. As I understand it, there are serious problems in Germany to the point that even the chancellor, they say, secretly appealed to Trump to somehow resolve the issue. But economists told me at the end of last week, Dasha, all these sanctions have not actually been implemented yet. They might only be introduced in November, and even then, at the end of the month. Igor Vladimirovich, what is happening? Please tell us.
Well, the European Union usually imposes sanctions, but with a certain delay. This is because there is always some issue with contracts. Contracts have been signed, the contract must be fulfilled, and then suddenly you make a decision. And in that case, you end up with a contract that can't be fulfilled. And if it can't be fulfilled, then claims can be made against the government for compensation. Losses will be incurred. That's why a certain period is usually given to, so to speak, wrap things up. That's all there is to it. Sometimes that's fine, sometimes it's not so good. Probably the dumbest way to wrap things up was in 2022, when the European Union, I think around May, introduced this price cap on Russian oil, but announced that it would only take effect at the end of the year, and this created an extremely advantageous situation for Russia. Everyone rushed to buy Russian oil, and Russia received both huge volumes and even a price premium, earning almost an extra $200 billion, which definitely helped to keep the war going up to this point. It sounds crazy, but there was this unreasonable idea to delay the sanctions. But the European Union always does this with LNG, with other products. They give a certain period so that Europe can properly prepare for it. That is to protect their own interests. You shouldn't assume that their main goal is to help Ukraine or to punish Russia as harshly as possible. They do want to punish Russia, but in such a way that they themselves don't suffer. That's why the sanctions are postponed, so that European companies have time to adapt, wrap up contracts, and avoid getting hit by sanctions and all sorts of penalties. So that's the story. They want to punish Russia, but they want to make sure they don't suffer themselves. No one wants to make sacrifices.
And are you satisfied with Trump's decision regarding Rosneft and Lukoil or not? And I'm curious why.
Well, that's good. From the point of view that, after all, up until now, Trump had generally avoided imposing sanctions. That is, he kept offering Putin some kind of carrots, but never once used the stick. He always said, yeah, Trump, we're different, but Biden was like this. He was always irritating Russia, while we will try to come to an agreement with Russia. But as you know, he did everything he could up to and including the meeting in Alaska, which was an absolute disgrace, a truly nightmarish story. I still can't forget how the poor American Marine is unrolling the carpet for Putin to walk on, but God didn't allow it. In general, he tried to win Putin over with sweet talk. But here, after all, there are sanctions. That means he's run out of options. He's reached the limit of his patience and tolerance. So here, again, what's important is not so much the economic sequence of these sanctions, but the very fact itself. It's fundamental that he has set out on the path of sanctions. Once you get on a certain path, it's easier to take the next step. You overcome the inertia of inaction, and then you start moving forward. So what's important is that this has been done, it's been implemented, and accordingly, there will be some consequences. We'll see what they are. In any case, it's clear that even some major Chinese companies have started reconsidering the possibility of purchasing Euro oil, Lukoil, so as not to fall under American secondary sanctions. So in this sense, there's nothing bad about it, only good. So this is a qualitatively different stage of sanctions against Russia from Trump.
Igor Vladimirovich, to wrap up, I'd like to ask you a question. Look, right now, Trump confidently said that Chinese companies have suspended their purchases and that Indian companies have completely stopped state purchases of Russian oil. But everyone says this is disinformation. It's not true. Everyone is buying. Everyone is buying. Nothing has been stopped.
Well, Trump, as you know, is quick with his words. For him to say that, he has no filters at all. So he can say anything. But in principle, of course, as we understand, some kind of process has started. It's not moving quickly because everyone is counting their money. Everyone is weighing how profitable it is to maintain relations with Russia and get oil at a discount. And on the other hand, how much they might lose from higher tariffs when trading with the US. As far as I know, there is already some preliminary calculation, and it is not in Russia's favor. That is, India's losses from higher tariffs are significant, and this will lead to very negative situations for small Indian businesses, including those in agriculture, and this in turn will create undesirable socio-political tension, which of course Modi does not need either. Therefore, I think that, of course, there will be some reduction in purchases. I don't know if India will completely stop buying Russian oil, although there is already some information that they are trying to negotiate with Iran about purchasing oil. Well, as far as I know, they even asked Trump to lift some sanctions from Iran so that they could buy oil. But so far, as I understand it, Trump hasn't done that. But in principle, if some kind of loophole opens up, then in general, oil from Iran will easily reach India. As you understand, delivering it is not very difficult. It's not a very long distance. By the way, Iran has long been offering to supply oil to India and at a price lower than Russian oil. In other words, they are ready to undercut prices. These are very peculiar friends who are quite happy to push Russia out of the Indian market. So I think this might not happen immediately, not in a month or two, but there will be some transformation in the scheme of oil supplies to India and China. Moreover, when you talk about China, you have to keep in mind that China, for entirely objective reasons, will be reducing its purchases even without any pressure from the US. The fact is that China is changing its energy balance, focusing on electricity, and it's not just about renewable energy. They are now building a new cascade of power plants. Of course, this won't happen quickly. It will take several years. But right now, they are building gigantic cascades of hydroelectric power stations in Tibet on some river. Just so you understand the scale of the construction, the investment in this project amounts to $67 billion. In other words, China is developing its electric power industry very intensively, and as a result, its demand for fuel and consequently for oil is decreasing. At the same time, this is indeed also related to transportation. China, for example, is experiencing a boom in the production and sale of electric trucks this year, as far as we know. Not sedans, but trucks. Accordingly, the demand for diesel fuel is decreasing. So in this sense, Russia has poor prospects for exports. This doesn't mean that everything will collapse instantly, but revenues will decline. And this is the only source of life for the Russian state. Igor Vladimirovich?
So in conclusion, we see that Putin said, it doesn't matter to us. We're not afraid. We're fine with everything. So sanctions from the European Union, sanctions from Trump, strikes on oil refineries, 20%. They've slightly slowed down the processing in the oil extraction sector. We see that Russia is exporting oil products from China and Belarus. Putin says, we don't care. Dmitriev flies to Miami, meets with Vitkov. Your assumption now. And then Dmitriev says, we are close to an agreement. So your assumption, after all, will they be able to pressure Putin in the next trimester so that he stops at the line of fire, considering all these factors and the meeting and then between Trump and Xi? Or is stopping the war for Putin still akin to the death of his Kremlin regime?
Well, the second option. He will try to keep fighting as long as he lives and as long as he breathes. And he, as you know, hopes to live a long life. But again, we need to understand that there are, so to speak, these thousands of cuts. And the blood is flowing out. And look, what are we seeing now? That suddenly in October, we receive information about a drop in the volume of military production. This means that apparently about 2 months ago, they stopped funding it. There is no money. They stopped funding military production. This means that in reality, the overall economic safety margin is small. It's already starting to run out. That's why Putin may very well want to keep fighting until his last breath. But whether the economy will allow for that is hard to say. My hypothesis is that Russia's economy is becoming weaker and weaker. And whatever Putin says about how it doesn't matter to us, it's all nonsense. The economy is declining. The economy is in trouble. I've already said that the budget has a huge deficit. And now they've presented the budget for 1926 to 1928. It's a fake budget, completely unworkable. And everyone already understands this. Everyone pretends that they'll adopt it as a serious document, but they know it's a fake, that there won't be such revenues, the expenses will be huge, and then they'll adjust it as they go along. In other words, the Russian government can no longer manage its own finances. So this collapse of the economy isn't some made-up concept, it's a real story. It could lead to the economy simply falling apart. And so it won't be that Putin wants to end the war, but that he'll have to do something so the economy doesn't completely collapse. He'll do it out of desperation, not out of joy.
Dear audience, please like this video. I know you really love Igor Lipsits for his sparkling humor, professionalism, and charisma. So friends, please subscribe to his YouTube channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dasha Schaslyva, and write a few kind words in the comments in support of Ukraine's armed forces, Ukraine, and our tandem. The well-known economist, top economist Igor Lipsits. Igor Vladimirovich, thank you, and I hope we will meet again soon.
All the best. Take care.